Hey there, fellow survivors and all you killers out there, and especially all of you killers this time around. My name's Matt, and welcome to the Campfire, a series of character and lore analyses on the people, places, and things that make up the entity's trials in Dead by Daylight. Now, for every concept of good in stories like the one the entity has set into motion, there's an equal and opposing faction of evil. In our tales of terror in the trials, our unfortunate survivors make up the side of good, the Lightbringers. In the classical sense, these are the heroes of our story, the ones we root for. To call the entity an equal force for them to go up against would be a disservice to the vast and primordial nature of the beast. In the entity's stead, the survivors must face the nightmares, the slashers, the killers. Now, originally my plan was to choose one killer to study and explore at first. I had to make a quick change of plans when I realized that more information could be gathered by exploring the killers as a collective in service to the entity. After coming across an excerpt from Benedict Baker's journal, and believe me, Mr. Baker is another topic that will get a special in-depth analysis at some point later, there are a lot of questions and observations to take in. In the entry, he describes a few impressions about the killers. For one, he mentions that they appear to have a flicker of humanity, but goes on to say he fails to see some sort of humanity in them. This might seem like an inconsistency, but what if it isn't? He might have meant that he can see a glimmer of the person that they were before the entity. That glimmer, though, may be the part that appealed to the entity, that malevolent piece of them that made them so enticing to it in the first place. Based on his writing, the killers seem fairly one-minded. It's not to kill the survivors necessarily, though. It's to serve the entity. Now, Baker describes the motions the killers go through as they attempt to chase him, stopping short of killing him to place him on hooks that they can find. This brings me to one possibility, and that's that the entity shreds away any piece of them that won't serve his purpose. The humanity that they have retained isn't compassionate or merciful. It's the part of them that had pressed beyond that to be alright with murdering someone. This would, of course, take more work to stop them, just short of actually killing someone under normal circumstances. It stands to reason that if the killers take matters into their own hands, survivors wouldn't make it to the hook, which means the entity would never be fed. To theorize a little further, this probably means that a few things are true. First, some of the killers likely could have killed some earlier survivors that are no longer around. We see quotes and records of other survivors who never seem to appear again. Maybe they're still running in other trials, or maybe they didn't make it before the entity learned that it had to restrain its minions. The second piece of this is that we can see the killers murder survivors by their own hands under the blessing of the Memento Mori add-on, which allows the killer to use their own MO, and their own hands, to end a survivor's life. This might seem contradictory to my theory on the entity's influence over the killers, but hear me out. If the entity's worried about its survivors losing too much hope, maybe there's a concern that the killers can break from their servitude if they aren't given some agency. By offering up the Memento Mori charms for the killers, it allows them to tap into their nature and act as they would without the entity's influence. It still somehow benefits the entity, though, since the quotes along with them sound like the killer is doing the entity a favor, or that they're being given a gift as praise for a job well done. Third is that the killers are most likely in the same position the survivors are, stuck in a perpetual series of trials with no end in sight unless their goal was to be in an endless slaughterfest with little to no autonomy. Anything the entity may have promised or any aspirations they may have had in their situation is null and void. Whatever scraps of their former life they've held on to, and there are memories and impulses in there to be sure, they're just tools for the entity when all's said and done. Now, one other note in Baker's journal entry details how the killers look like they've been inflicting harm on themselves. It's a strange observation since, one, unless he's watched it firsthand, there's no reliable way to tell how these wounds might have been inflicted, and two, these monsters have probably had people clawing, attacking, and generally fighting back in a bid for their lives. Thanks to the entity's blessings, though, survivors have obviously learned that fighting back is ineffective, and even if they did, the likelihood that they could inflict any meaningful damage to one of the killers is very low. They have heavy pallets dropped on them constantly without so much as a scrape. There's also no confirmation that the killers interact, so they probably aren't attacking one another, and honestly, it wouldn't do for the entity's plan to have his followers carving each other up. Does Benedict have the correct observation, then? Maybe. There are a few possibilities. For one, we can't be sure that if a killer doesn't perform well, they aren't punished. By the entity? Maybe. The entity has a way of keeping its metaphorical hands clean in these cases, though, so if there is a punishment for poor performance, there's a good chance that the killers are forced to inflict it on themselves. That said, between the lore and documents that have been presented and some comments from the powers that be, it's been heavily implied that while some of the killers are more than happy to take up the entity's mantle, others are a little more resistant. While this would be something to explore on a case-by-case basis, the powers that be have said that if people were to investigate the killer's physical forms, there may be some hints as to just how willing or resistant they might have been. Maybe some of these wounds were inflicted during their induction to the entity's ranks. Sounds like we may have more research to do on each of them. Now, obviously, this is meant to be an introduction to the killers and their role in the game that the entity has put in place. Thankfully, Benedict Baker's journal is full of information and observations on a variety of subjects, and we can get some insight into how the evils in the trials work. They hold on to some piece of their instincts from before, but they're no longer human. They hunt, but they're restrained by their new master. Where do they go between trials? Certainly not to the peace of the campfire. Are they in stasis somewhere? Are they being punished or commended for their most recent achievements? There's a lot that I don't know and that I'll be researching for a follow-up on this topic. Some answers might be found by looking into the entity itself, and some may be uncovered by looking at each of the killers and how they came to be chosen. This is just the center of a web of information that needs to be investigated one strand at a time. And that's it for this Sit by the Campfire. Once again, if you have any questions or comments, I'm all for deconstructive or constructive conversation. And if you have any suggestions about what you'd like to hear about next or just want to reach out, feel free to leave a comment or find me on Twitter at CampfireTender. Thanks for listening. Until next time.